Hi everyone, my name is Dieter. You may know me or you may not know me from any of those projects. I'm just listing them there to demonstrate that I really enjoy working on open source monitoring because that's what all these tools are about. But I'm not going to talk about any of those. I also blog about monitoring. I've recently done some posts about fault detection and stuff like that. Somebody once emailed me and said, one of your projects is a little quixotic. And I was like, what does that mean? So I Googled it, and it means idealistic without regard to practicality. And like, if you need a sentence to describe me, like that would be it. You know, I can get a little bit idealistic, and my tools are not always the most practically useful out of the box. Which is why it's fun now to work on Grafana, which is like so good at bringing power to you in like such an accessible and friendly way. I also work at RingTech now. We try to contribute a lot to Grafana and like keep accelerating its development and keeping it 100% open source because we're all about 100% open source, including our SaaS offering. So yeah, Raj already said this, but this is a result of the survey. Alerting came up as the #1 requested feature. So we have about 5 people focusing on this effort. Not everyone is full-time, but we have a few people developing on it, prototyping. Some people are like technical backgrounds. We have some people thinking about the products. Matt is our UX expert, so he works a lot on the UX stuff. And also we try to involve you guys, the community, as much as we can. We have this GitHub issue where we really welcome any feedback, questions, goals, concerns you may have. We read everything, we discuss everything. So we try to have a very open development effort, even though some meetings have to be closed and between the team just so that we can focus. So one of the approaches that we're taking in going about developing a learning system is idealized design. This is something that came out of AT&T Bell Labs, basically after a century of stagnation of development in telephone systems where they were stuck with rotary phones. And they had been doing all these little iterative improvements, these small incremental improvements to their tools, and they stagnated. And then they just said, okay, let's try something new. Let's forget about everything. Let's pretend all our current technology doesn't exist. And we're basically given the opportunity to imagine the perfect ideal system. They come up with all these ideas and features, and then they bring it down to what is actually realistically feasible. And by doing that, they basically revolutionized telephone technology. They introduced touch tone, conference calls, voicemail, mobile phones, and so on. And so that's an approach that we try to take sometimes. This is very related to brainstorming, of course. Basically, anything goes. You throw out as many ideas as you can. You can use them as building blocks for other ideas. And then only later do you decide, okay, this is not good, and what is good. And so one thing that became really apparent to me is that alerting is not just a feature that like is part of a bigger framework, like a visualization framework like Grafana. It actually is just as big in terms of scope and context. There is so much about alerting. And in fact, they even integrate a lot more than I thought they did. For example, when you're setting up a visualization, it makes a lot of sense to configure your alerting on the same data you're visualizing. And once you've set up the alerting, it makes sense to pull in the visualization of the state of that alert, or to pull in other alerts that work on related data as what you're looking at. And from the other end, from the alerting side, obviously alert notifications contain a lot of visualizations, or at least they should, because they should give you context about what's going on. So there's a lot of graphs and visualizations there. Another thing that we basically wanted to do is give our Matt, our UX guy, the freedom that he needs to imagine how it could be. We didn't want to say, okay, let's first create a backend and then let's write a front end that just leverages it. We basically said, what would be the perfect user experience? And then from there, let's see what we can implement. There's a few things that we had to watch out for, though. One thing is second system syndrome, which basically means when you're given a chance to build something new from scratch, you might want to address every single shortcoming of every previous system. And that's not something you want to do, because then you just end up with such a convoluted mess of features. So this is something we have to do. We have to say no sometimes to certain features, and it's hard. We've not always been very good at it, but I think we're getting better at it, at making decisions about we want to have a focused product. And for me personally, at one point I started thinking about what is it about Grafana that made it so successful? And I don't know if you know this quote, but I love this quote. And it says, if you prevent people from doing stupid things, you also prevent people from doing smart things. And so this, for me, like this, Grafana does this really well. It exposes so much power to you through a really nice user interface. And you can shoot yourself in the foot. Like, if you don't really know what you're doing, you might create a visualization that is misleading or not accurate. And I think that's fine. And that's something I've learned from Grafana. It's better right now to just give you all that power. And for power users, that's basically the right thing to do right now. And then later, further down the road, maybe years from now, we'll focus on how do we make it more accessible to beginner users or who are less experienced. But this basically allows us to make certain decisions easier. So basically, we have to find a balance between all these different ideas and all these different approaches. And we're not a big research lab like AT&T Bell Labs. We're a startup with limited resources. So it's really interesting how to find that balance. And I found that building a solid learning system is really, really, really hard. But now, anyway, we started prototyping, and this is really fun. Now we're just prototyping ideas, iterating, making them better. And one thing that helps with this is what I like to call an evolvable design, which basically means don't make any design decision that's going to make it hard later to change it up or to migrate to a different approach. So basically, don't work yourself into a corner that's going to make it hard to make incremental improvements later. All right, so let's make it a little bit more concrete. This is the most boring slide in the presentation, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically the idea is we want to think about what are all the different ways by which people are introduced to the alerting system. Maybe they're visualizing data and they want to create an alert from there, or they got a link from somebody, or they're looking at a notification email. There's all these different ways that you're exposed to an alerting system, and every single way has to make the most sense. Now I'm going to show some of the mock-ups that we've been working on. I think this is going to be interesting and fun because it basically shows our thought process. So after a bunch of days of very intense whiteboarding, we realized it makes the most sense to configure your alerting rules within Grafana panels. In your Grafana panel, you're already configuring your queries and your visualizations, and that's where your alerting queries should go. And this first mock-up, we had this idea of allowing you to define multiple alerting rules, but multiple alerting rules in one panel was a little bit overkill. So then we said, all right, we'll just have one alerting rule, and you can basically define one critical and one warning, but it would still let you select a different query for critical and another query for warning, and it would even let you then change the query so that the query you're alerting on was different than what you were visualizing. And we thought, okay, this is all getting a little bit too complicated. There's some traps there. Let's even simplify it further. And then we said, okay, how about you can only alert on a query that is in your metrics tab. Typically, you will be visualizing the query, but you could also disable the visualization. But the point is, you just have one place where you define all your queries, and there can be no confusion. We decided to actually allow your thresholds to apply to multiple queries, and put the alerting configuration into a separate alerting tab. But then it was a little bit tricky to know, okay, which query was what again, because I configured it on the metrics tab. So we were playing with some of these ideas, like with these mini graphs, to visualize what you were working with. We weren't really too happy with that either. So ultimately, we decided to keep it even simpler and have something basically mimic the same interface as the metrics tab, where you just have your list of all your metrics, and you just configure on which metrics to apply your alerting rules. We also thought it would be really nice to give you interactive setting of thresholds by basically interactively on your graph sliding your threshold bars up and down. as opposed to being limited to having to manually enter numbers into form fields. We think this is going to be really neat. It's going to be very tricky to implement, but this is our ideal. And then what you can see on this one here specifically is we also want to be able to basically tell you, based on this current threshold, this is how many times you would have been alerted with a critical or a warning. Then we also had a lot of back and forth about how to model the notification settings, like where do you define teams if you have such a concept, or like your alerting destinations such as Slack, PagerDuty, email, and so on. Where do you configure whether you want to get warnings or criticals. We ultimately decided to put most of the stuff in a central place, so you would be able to centrally define, okay, this is my ops team, they have a Slack channel or an email address, and they're interested in all the warnings and the criticals. And then maybe you have a separate email for just the warnings or something like that. And you just configure that centrally and then refer to those from the alerting rule. But in the first prototype, it's probably going to look a lot simpler, where you just add an email address or a Slack channel right there in the alerting rule. But in the backend, we already store it in such a way that we will be able to evolve it to a more to the more rich experience with the centralized management of the notifications. And so everything together would probably look something sort of like this. A lot of the stuff I already spoke about, but I do want to point out something that we've added here is that green red bar just below the graph that would basically pull in the alerting state. And we also can use annotations to mark state transitions of your alert. Also, another idea that we want to do is basically help you in converting any threshold settings you may have and convert them into alerting settings. So this was all on the level of the panel. So we also have to be able to think of the dashboard level. And a common question here would be, okay, I have this dashboard. What are all the alerting rules that I have defined on this dashboard? So we came up with a few ways to visualize it. And the most interesting one, I would say, is this one. We also played with another idea of keeping it simpler and just say, okay, I want to have a mode where I can just highlight the graphs that have alerting settings and maybe even just only show the series that have alerting enabled on them and put all the other graphs in the background. And then something that I think is going to be really useful, and a lot of people have asked for this, is coloring the border or the background of your panels to reflect the current state. You can see a few here are in yellow, then there's the one in red for critical. It will probably end up looking something like this. And then zooming even out more, you also want to be able to see what are all the alerting rules that have defined across all of my dashboards. And so we've also been playing with a lot of different mockups for that, basically different ways of visualizing your alerts on a global level. And probably it will look something like this, where you can optionally expand and get like a richer view, like the graph of your data. All of this is thanks to that guy, Matt, our UX guy. So if you enjoyed watching these mockups, he's to thank. So Grafana is really good at data visualization, no question there. And we're basically going to add alert configuration to it and visualization of the alerting state. But there's still something missing, right? That would be the handler. There should be handlers that will schedule your alerts, that will execute your alerts, and actually send the notifications. And that is not something we necessarily want to put in Grafana itself. And so a few people have asked to be able to just keep using their existing alerting system. My personal favorite is Boson, but some people are using Nagios or Sensu or Cabot or any of the other ones. And so the idea would be that there would be a script or a tool that queries Grafana for all your alerting rules and exports it to configuration for these tools. And then these tools can execute the alerts, send out the notifications, and then update the state in Grafana somehow. But because that would still require setting up a third-party system, we still want to provide a really nice out-of-the-box experience for those people who want it, and somehow include the alert scheduling, execution, and sending of notifications, and somehow ship that along with Grafana. So now I want to see some show of hands. Basically, I described two approaches. One approach would be, so your configuration of alerting will be in Grafana and the visualization of it. But as far as execution of your alerts, do you think it would be sufficient for you if we just gave you a tool that came with Grafana and that you didn't have to worry about, that would execute your alerts and send out your notifications? Do you think that would be enough for you?
What's the name? What's the other?
Okay. Well, the alternative is having to use one of the third-party systems. Basically, Boson, Cabot, Nagios, Sensu. Is that something that for you would be a requirement, that you would be able to export the alerting rules from Grafana and store it as configuration for Nagios or Sensu and have that execute your rules?
Is it a Boolean choice? Can you not have both?
Okay, let's do both as well. Let's do both as well.
Well, like a default, a sensible default, and then roll your own, whether it's Boson or Riemann or something.
But the thing that I'm wondering mostly about is, do you need, is there a requirement from anyone to I have to use Boson or I have to use Nagios or Sensu? Or would it be okay for you to just use whatever we provide?
Nope.
All right, so let's try to vote again. Do you think, okay, I have to use Boson or Sensu, or I already have a tool and that's what I want to use to execute my alerting rules? Okay, that's 10%. So for all of the other ones, you would be okay with us providing a tool that executes your alerts, sends notifications. Correct? Show of hands?
So a question about that.
Yeah.
Like we have right now, we're using Sensu. We have a Ruby script that goes and interacts with PagerDuty. Would we be able to use the same script, or would we have to? Would Grafana be able to execute the same script, or would we have to have a separate solution? One for Grafana telling PagerDuty and one for Sensu telling PagerDuty.
Sorry, I didn't get it. Can you say that again?
The script that goes and sends interacts with PagerDuty integration. Would we be able to use the same script that Grafana executes, whereas Sensu currently executes the integration script?
Yes.
Would Grafana be able to execute the same script, or would we have to maintain this separate?
It probably should. I don't know exactly what the script would look like, but probably. Anthony? How about we talk about that afterwards? But the point is, this is one of the main things that we're still trying to figure out. And
I think the question can also be rephrased in terms of how many of you guys are so tied to your existing alerting, notification, and scheduling systems that you wouldn't want to change, no matter how much convenience you could get from this experience, right?
Yeah.
So you suspect that a
I
lot
think
of
it's a no-brainer. You have to provide integration with external APIs.
Yeah, in terms of adoption, you have to get buy-in, right? If my graphs go down, that stinks. If alerting goes down,
right.
That's why I was saying, is it a Boolean choice?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a maturity thing there too, right? So maybe
Over
it's
time,
not
the
totally
decision
there,
gets better.
but
Right.
there's a migration.
Sure. Right. That's a fair point.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about internally as well.
Right.
Let's definitely keep talking about this because we're still trying to figure out the ins and outs of this topic. It would be really great if you could also maybe go to the ticket that I mentioned, and I'll show it at the end as well, and just talk about what you want. I will try to accommodate everyone and make sure we have a nice solution. So I think through the mockups, a lot of it already kind of came up, but I do want to emphasize a few more points that I think are really interesting about why alerting in Grafana makes sense, or at least the configuration and visualization aspect of it. The first one is the unified workflow. I think it makes a lot of sense. People already organize their visualizations on dashboards, and everyone is working on their visualizations. And I think it's really nice to be able to configure your alerts in the same place as where you're visualizing it. The next thing is the integration. Grafana is doing pretty well, I think, in integrating with all kinds of data source, from Graphite to InfluxDB, to Elasticsearch, to CloudWatch, to Prometheus. And I think it makes a lot of sense for alerting to be able to leverage that. Then another thing that Grafana does is it is able to expose a lot of power from your data store through a UX. Query editors, panel editors, and we basically want to keep that concept going and do the same thing for alerting rules and give you a very nice interactive experience where you can configure your alerting rules. So to conclude, I think it's all about the workflow. Visualization and alerting are so tightly coupled and they're so interrelated that I think it also makes sense for the workflow to be integrated. And for this to work, obviously, tools need to be composable and compatible. That's why we want to work on the integrations with the handlers so that you will be able to keep using Nagios or Sensu or Boson or whatever you do. Some people have requested this on a ticket as well. And I'm really curious to see, once we build out the APIs, and we will basically build the infrastructure to make this possible. I'm looking forward to see people in the community actually starting to use this and starting to build integration scripts. We are currently prototyping. It will appear somehow in Grafana 2x, maybe 2.6, 2.7, we're not quite sure yet, but it's coming. And that's it. So there's a ticket. You can ask more or post that over there. And we also have 5 more minutes for questions right now. So fire them up.
Thanks, Dieter.
Is it going to be possible to put to add functions to the threshold? So like I can imagine for like a counter, I'd probably want to have a moving threshold over time.
So the question is, can I put functions on my thresholds? Sort of. So the way we're thinking of it currently is we're gonna, like a lot of power should come from the data source already. Like in Graphite's case, you have so many moving average functions and stuff like that. So you should already be able to create a good query that gives you the data that you want to set a threshold on. However, first of all, not all the data stores are equally good at providing processing functions. And I think the main thing that we want to do to help with that, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but let me know, is that we will give you a window of time. So you say, okay, I want to put alerting on this query, and that query is your Graphite query, your InfluxDB query, whatever it is. And then you would be able to say, select the window of, let's say, the last 2 minutes, take the average of it, or the mean or something, and then apply that to a threshold. Is that sort of what you meant?
I mean, you can do that sort of, but the problem is that ultimately the threshold is flat. So if I could create like a function, like let's say, I know that my traffic spikes at noon every day. So from noon to 1, my threshold would be this value, and then run another function that's slowly descending over time.
So do you want your query to be, do you want a threshold to be a query, potentially?
I mean, that would be really nice.
So one of the mock-ups, I mean, maybe,
Yeah. So we actually were playing with this idea as well. Basically use one of your existing queries as a threshold line. Maybe we'll do it, but the thing that I like to think about is don't forget, your alerting query can be any query. So you could set an alert on query A minus query B. Like if you want to use B as your threshold, instead of comparing A to B, you could do A minus B, put that in your C, and then set a threshold on C, for example.
Are you talking about like anomaly detection? So like if
Yeah.
this metric changes, 40% in 5 minutes. Then
Yeah, I think you could do a basic form of anomaly detection using this mechanism. We might end up implementing something like this. I don't think there's a strong need for it, but it seems quite nice, but we have to figure out, is it worth it?
Yeah, another example would be flapping. Like decide whether you're like stable above the threshold for a minute at least, or you're flapping, and then it's just interesting actually.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
In terms of Grafana providing more of a complete alerting solution, I'm not sure I understand what the limits of that would be. 'Cause I mean, I think you can visualize it on a graph in different ways, and talked earlier about maybe managing notifications directly. But if you know, in terms of the workflow around handling alerts, you might have an ops team that is going to sort of acknowledge, I'm going to take ownership of it. Somebody's going to look at these graphs or other information and say, now it's okay, so sort of silence that alert. You know, there's a workflow around that, and if you start to take on that role, then there's also the fact that you've got other sources of alerting information. Some application is self-declared, I'm in a bad state, and you would want to integrate that into the same kind of unified UX experience.
Yeah, so the topic of managing alerting state, basically. That's something that we don't want to do in Grafana. I think that's something that should be managed by an external tool. For example, PagerDuty does this. There's an open source alerting tool that does this, but the name escapes me. But basically managing which alerts, like basically acknowledgements, sending out notifications, that kind of stuff, that's something that we don't want to build into the core of Grafana. Nicholas?
Are you saying that you don't want to be responsible for the action that's taken on an alert? You want to be responsible for detecting a specifically defined condition and then notifying like a binary target, say, yes, we have an alert, now take action.
So,
Like, are you excluding yourself from the action? Or, like, where are you drawing the line of what you don't want to do?
so it depends what you mean with action. So the question is, what kind of actions outbound after an alert changes state do we want to implement in Grafana? I think the big question we're still trying to figure out, with the help of all of you, is how do we implement this handler system where an external tool of your choice, be it Nagios, Sensu, Boson, evaluates the alerts, schedules the alerts, evaluates them, sends out notifications, is responsible for acknowledgements, state management, and so on. We do want to provide a built-in solution for those people who want to have a very simple out-of-the-box experience that takes care of the alert scheduling, the alert execution, and the notifications. But notifications-wise, for example, it would probably still just send out an email to something else or call a webhook, do some kind of HTTP requests, send a message to Slack, something like that.
People could still use PagerDuty with this, right? I mean, we're not necessarily going all the way into PagerDuty functionality. And like Peter said, we're still trying to figure out where we stop. But we know we're not going all the way into replicating PagerDuty.
But, like, you would send an email, right? Is that in your...
Yeah.
If you take the built-in
helpful for you to, like, figure out, like, exactly where that line is. Like, what do you want to do? What don't you want to do?
I think that's largely going to be up to the user. Where do they put their trust and which tool do they want to use for what? If they decide to use the built-in handler, then they could use an email notification, and then the built-in handler would connect to an SMTP server or something and send out the message. If you want something more reliable, there should definitely be ways to do that. So I'm sorry, we're out of time, it looks like. I'll happily talk more about this. I think we have a break after a few more talks, so maybe we can talk more after that.